The neighborhood looked like something out of a glossy real estate brochure. Perfectly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, pastel houses with fresh paint, and SUVs lined neatly in every driveway. This was the kind of place where nothing was allowed to look out of place, not even a single weed. Rules here weren't just guidelines, they were a way of life. The Homeowners Association took pride in maintaining standards, and those standards were enforced with quiet ruthlessness. Into this polished world lived a man who didn't quite fit the picture. He wore simple clothes, drove an old, slightly scratched truck, and waved politely but rarely spoke. To most neighbors, he was just that guy, quiet, reserved, and oddly uninterested in keeping up appearances. His name on the HOA register read, Keanu Reeves. Keanu's house was modest compared to the others. The paint wasn't peeling, the lawn wasn't dead, but it wasn't perfect either. Grass grew a little uneven. The fence showed its age. Decorations were minimal, almost non-existent. There were no flashy lights, no loud parties, no renovations meant to impress. He spent most evenings sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky change colors as the sun went down. He greeted neighbors with a nod and a warm smile, but never lingered long enough to become part of their circles. To some, his quiet nature was suspicious. To others, it was irritating. In a place obsessed with uniformity, simplicity stood out like rebellion. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. A thin envelope slipped under his door, stamped with the HOA logo. Lawn not maintained to community standards. Keanu read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. He trimmed the grass later that week, careful but unhurried. A few days later, another notice arrived, this time about the fence. Then another about the color of his front door. The letters grew firmer in tone, less polite, more threatening. Fines were mentioned. Deadlines were underlined. Somewhere along the way, the HOA had decided that Keanu Reeves was a problem that needed correcting. Whispers began to circulate. At mailboxes, over backyard fences, during morning walks. "He's so cheap," one neighbor scoffed. "If he can't afford to live here properly, why did he move in?" another asked. Someone joked that he must be hiding something. They didn't know what he did for a living, and they never bothered to ask. All they saw was an older truck and a man who didn't try to impress. In their minds, wealth was loud. New cars, renovations, upgrades. Quiet humility didn't fit the equation. The HOA president, a man who loved control almost as much as order, took particular interest. To him, Keanu wasn't just a resident, he was a challenge. Yet through it all, Keanu remained calm. He never raised his voice, never argued. When approached, he listened. When accused, he nodded. He paid attention, but he did not defend himself. Inside that simple house, there were no trophies on the walls, no symbols of status, only memories, grief, and a deliberate choice to live lightly in a world that demanded excess. As the HOA sharpened its focus on him, none of them realized one crucial thing. They weren't dealing with a man who couldn't comply. They were dealing with a man who had already lost enough to know what truly mattered. And by choosing him as their target, they had taken the first step toward a lesson they would never forget. The second phase didn't begin with shouting or confrontation, it began with paperwork. More envelopes appeared, thicker this time, each stamped with the authority of the HOA. The language shifted from corrective to punitive. Failure to comply will result in fines. Continued violations may lead to legal action. Keanu read every word carefully, the same way he approached everything else in life, slowly, deliberately. He placed the letters in a neat stack on his kitchen counter. Outside, the neighborhood continued to gleam, but inside those envelopes was a clear message. His quiet existence was no longer tolerated. Soon, the notices turned into fines. Small at first, then larger. $100 here, $200 there. Each one came with a deadline and a thinly veiled threat. The HOA board meetings, once dull and procedural, now included his name as a regular agenda item. Resident Reeves, non-compliance ongoing, the president would say, tapping his pen like a judge's gavel. To the board, Keanu had become less of a person and more of a case file. No one mentioned his courtesy, his calm demeanor, or the fact that he never caused trouble. All that mattered was that he didn't conform. One evening, a formal summons arrived. He was required to attend the next HOA meeting. The room was packed when he walked in, neighbors whispering, chairs scraping, eyes following him as if he were on trial. The HOA president didn't bother with pleasantries. He listed violations one by one, his tone sharp, rehearsed, almost eager. "These rules apply to everyone," he said, staring directly at Keanu. "No exceptions." A few neighbors nodded in agreement. Others smirked. Someone muttered, "About time." Keanu listened without interrupting, his hands folded calmly in front of him. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood slowly. The room quieted, not because they respected him, but because they expected resistance. An argument. An excuse. Instead, he simply said, "I understand the rules." His voice was steady, gentle. No anger. No defensiveness. The HOA president frowned, clearly disappointed. "Then why haven't you complied?" he snapped. Keanu paused, as if weighing the question, then replied, "I will take care of what I can." It wasn't the answer they wanted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't satisfy their hunger for control. And somehow, that made it worse. After that meeting, the pressure intensified. Inspection notices came without warning. Emails arrived late at night. The fines doubled. The HOA president took personal charge, determined to break the man who refused to bend in the expected way. Neighbors began avoiding Keanu, afraid association might put them under scrutiny too. The quiet nods turned into averted eyes. Still, every morning, Keanu stepped outside, greeted the day, and went about his life with the same unhurried grace. He wasn't fighting back, but he wasn't retreating either. What the HOA failed to understand was this: escalation only works when someone is afraid to lose. And Keanu Reeves had already endured losses far greater than a fine or a threat. Their tactics, meant to intimidate, only revealed their own smallness. Each notice, each meeting, each penalty drew an invisible line between power and dignity. And though the HOA believed they were tightening the net, they were, in truth, pushing themselves closer to a reckoning, one that would soon force them to confront the man behind the violations and the quiet strength they had mistaken for weakness. By the time the next HOA meeting was scheduled, tension clung to the neighborhood like heavy air before a storm. Keanu's name no longer appeared casually on the agenda. It was highlighted, bolded, impossible to ignore. The fines had reached a point where whispers turned into certainty. "He must be making a statement," people said. "Or maybe he's just stubborn." The room filled quickly that evening, chairs packed tighter than usual, neighbors eager for what they assumed would be the final confrontation. Keanu arrived quietly, taking a seat near the back, his presence calm in contrast to the restless energy buzzing around him. The HOA president wasted no time. He recited the violations again, his voice louder this time, sharper, as if volume could force obedience. "We've been more than patient," he said, scanning the room for approval. "The fines are substantial. Legal action is now on the table." A few heads nodded. Someone sighed dramatically. Then the president leaned forward and delivered the line everyone had been thinking but hadn't yet dared to say aloud. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "you clearly have the means. So why don't you just fix it?" The question landed hard, echoing through the room. For the first time, Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, resting loosely in his lap. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, heavy. This wasn't defiance. It was something else. When he finally lifted his eyes, they weren't angry or defensive. They were tired. He stood slowly, as he always did, but this time there was a subtle shift in the room. Something in his posture made people sit up straighter. "You're right," he said softly. "I could." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The HOA president looked almost relieved, certain he'd won. But Keanu continued. "I choose not to live differently," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "Not because I can't afford more, but because I don't need it." A few people exchanged glances. That wasn't the answer they expected. One of the board members, a woman who had stayed mostly quiet through previous meetings, leaned forward. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was curious. "Why?" she asked. Just one word. Simple. Honest. And somehow far more powerful than all the threats that had come before. Keanu took a breath, the kind that comes from deep inside the chest. Because I've learned what lasts, he said. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He didn't give details yet, no names, no dates, but he spoke of loss, of how life can take everything without warning. He talked about how noise, excess, and status fade quickly when you've stood on the other side of grief. The room, once restless, had gone still. Even the HOA president stopped tapping his pen. He finished without drama. "This life reminds me to stay grounded," Keanu said. "To remember what matters. To not let things own me." He sat back down, hands folded again, as if he hadn't just shifted the entire tone of the room. No one spoke for several seconds. The question that had been asked so casually, "Why don't you just fix it?" now hung in the air, transformed. For the first time, the HOA wasn't looking at a rule breaker or a problem resident. They were looking at a man who had made a conscious choice to live simply, and in that moment, their certainty began to crack. The silence after Keanu's words felt heavier than any argument that could have followed. No one rushed to speak. No one shuffled papers or cleared their throat. The HOA president, who had once filled every pause with authority, now sat still, his pen resting uselessly on the table. Keanu remained standing for a moment, not because he demanded attention, but because the room seemed to be holding its breath. Then, almost reluctantly, he continued, his voice quieter now, but unmistakably real. "There was a time," he said, "when I believed more would protect me." Heads tilted. Eyes softened. This was no longer a meeting about fences and lawns. He spoke of loss, not as a list of tragedies, but as a weight that reshaped how he saw the world. He described how life had taught him, again and again, that possessions don't anchor you when the ground disappears beneath your feet, that success, applause, and wealth mean very little when the people you love are gone. He didn't name names. He didn't dramatize the pain. He simply shared the truth, that grief has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. As he spoke, a few neighbors looked down, suddenly uncomfortable with how easily they had judged him. Keanu explained that simplicity wasn't an accident, it was a decision. A way to keep his life honest. "When you've lost enough," he said, "you stop chasing things that don't give anything back." The modest house, the old truck, the quiet routines, they were reminders, not of what he lacked, but of what he refused to let define him. He talked about how living simply helped him stay present, grounded, human. For him, comfort wasn't found in upgrades or appearances, but in moments of stillness. A sunrise, a conversation, the ability to move through the world without needing to prove anything. The room had changed. Neighbors who once whispered now listened. The board member who had asked why blinked back tears. Even the HOA president shifted in his seat, the sharp edge of his confidence dulled by something unfamiliar, empathy. For the first time, they saw the cost of their assumptions. They hadn't just enforced rules, they had projected their own values onto a man whose priorities were shaped by pain they couldn't see. The fines, the notices, the threats, all of it suddenly felt small, almost cruel. Keanu ended simply. "I live this way because it helps me remember," he said, "and because it leaves room to care about other people." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't demand understanding. He sat down, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The meeting room, once a place of control and judgment, now felt exposed, like a mirror had been turned on everyone inside it. The truth had done what no argument ever could. It had stripped the power from the rules and placed it squarely in humanity. And in that moment, the HOA realized they weren't facing a stubborn resident at all, but a man whose quiet life was built on lessons far deeper than any bylaw could measure. The meeting didn't end with applause or dramatic declarations. It ended quietly, almost awkwardly. Papers were gathered without urgency. Chairs scraped against the floor in uneven rhythms. No one seemed eager to leave, yet no one knew what to say. The HOA president cleared his throat, once, twice, then spoke with a tone far less certain than before. "Given the circumstances," he said, avoiding Keanu's eyes, "the board will review the fines." It wasn't an apology, but it was a retreat. For a man used to unquestioned authority, it was the closest thing to surrender. Within a week, the notices stopped. The emails went silent. A formal letter arrived stating that all outstanding fines had been withdrawn. No explanation, no conditions, just a bland statement that the matter was considered resolved. The HOA president announced his resignation shortly after, citing personal reasons. A new interim board member, one of the quieter, more thoughtful voices, took his place. The rules didn't disappear, but their enforcement softened. Inspections became respectful. Warnings turned into conversations. The neighborhood exhaled, even if most residents didn't fully understand why. Something else changed too. Neighbors who once avoided Keanu now greeted him with tentative smiles. A few stopped to talk. One afternoon, a single mother from 2 houses down knocked on his door, embarrassed, explaining she'd been struggling with a fine of her own. Keanu listened. The next day, he helped her draft a letter to the board, calmly outlining her situation. The fine was reduced. Word spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. People began to realize that the quiet man they judged was also the one willing to help without asking for recognition. Keanu never altered his home to impress anyone. The lawn stayed simple. The fence remained old but sturdy. The truck still rumbled down the street each morning. What changed wasn't his lifestyle, it was the way the neighborhood saw it. Simplicity no longer looked like neglect. Silence no longer felt like resistance. For some, it sparked uncomfortable self-reflection. They had spent years measuring worth through appearances, enforcing order without empathy. Keanu had forced them, unintentionally, to confront a harder truth. Control without compassion is just another form of failure. On a quiet evening not long after, Keanu sat on his porch as he always had, watching the sky fade from gold to deep blue. A neighbor waved. Another stopped to chat. Life moved on, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The HOA had learned its lesson, though it would never record it in minutes or bylaws. And Keanu, unchanged and unbothered, had offered them something rare, not a fight, not a lawsuit, but a mirror. In choosing dignity over dominance, he reminded everyone of a simple truth. Kindness costs nothing, but judgment costs everything.